All right, we're going to get started now. I think some more people are probably still connecting from the wait room. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Sam, and I'm a library assistant with San Mateo County Libraries. I'm excited to be here tonight to welcome Joanna Ho, author of The Silence That Binds Us. Before we begin, I just want to mention two of our author talks coming up. VC Tang's Cook-Along event, Come Eat Grandma, Thai Home Cooking on May 18th, and we actually have multiple in-person author visit story times with Vivian Chang and Eugenia Yo for their debut picture book, This Is Not My Home. Sign up at smcl.org/author talks. We really hope to see you at all of these events, or just one. Your microphone and video will be turned off for the talk, but feel free to use the chat and if you have questions, submit them using the Q&A because the chat moves fast and we might miss them. If you would like subtitles, click on CC and then show subtitles. And one more note, because our event tonight touches on issues of mental health, I want to remind everybody about the National Suicide Prevention Line 988. You can call to talk to a trained volunteer live about yourself or someone you know who's going through a hard time. It's free, it's 24/7, and you can talk about any problem or stress, big or small. Again, that's 988. And now, San Mateo County Libraries is so excited to introduce Joanna Ho. Joanna is the New York Times bestselling and award-winning author of Eyes That Kiss in the Corners, Eyes That Speak to the Stars, Playing at the Border, One Day, and The Silence That Binds Us. Joanna has been an English teacher, a dean, the designer of an alternative to prison program, a creator of educational professional development, and a high school vice principal. She lives in the Bay Area where she survives on homemade chocolate chip cookies, outdoor adventures, and dance parties with her kids. Her newest book, The Silence That Binds Us, is a hopeful and heart-rending young adult novel about healing, poetry, and speaking truth to power. After Maybelline Chen's brother Danny dies by suicide, racist accusations unfairly blame their parents for putting too much pressure on him. May's parents tell her to keep her head down, but she stands up and uses her poetry to speak out. It's up to May and her friends to take back the narrative. And with that, welcome, Joanna, and thank you so much for being with us today. I heard you have an awesome presentation for us.
I know I'm awesome, but I definitely have a presentation. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, and it looks like we have some people joining us all the way from Brooklyn. I'm from New York myself, so that's awesome. Big connection. Well, without further ado, Joanna, if you want to start your presentation about the book, we'll do a Q&A at the end. And a reminder, everyone, click on those three dots down at the bottom somewhere, and you can find the Q&A button to enter some questions, and we'll get to them at the end. And all right, Joanna, it's up to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. And hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. It's just such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. And I know everyone is busy, and so taking time out, especially from Brooklyn in the middle of the night, is a big commitment. I am just going to let you know off the bat, I am a former educator, and this is not going to be me talking to you for 40 minutes and then going to question and answer. So please, if possible, be near your computer or your phone, whatever you're logging in from. There will be questions and opportunities for you to participate. And I would definitely love to hear your thoughts as we go on. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And so I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about my story. Oops, it went a little ahead. So I was born in Minnesota. I was born to a Taiwanese mom, and then my biological dad is from mainland China. He spent a lot of his childhood in Hong Kong. I have a younger brother who is a year younger than me. And this is a picture of me in first grade. I wanted to be a teacher because my first grade teacher got a lot of presents at wintertime. And I thought in first grade that would be a pretty sweet gig. I did end up going into teaching, but not for reasons that I thought I was going into. I thought in first grade. This is a picture of me and my younger brother, who has grown way taller than me. This is my last day of high school. And when I was a senior in high school, I was invited by the school to go and participate in this weekend sort of leadership camp in the woods. They chose students, or they asked students from lots of different grade levels and demographics and backgrounds and social groups. And essentially what we did was participate in a weekend of, at the time it wasn't called this, but like very intense anti-racist, anti-bias training. We did a lot of activities that were really eye-opening for me. This is really where I came to start to understand systemic racism and sexism and ableism and all kinds of things that I don't know that I was really aware of consciously before. It gave me a lot of language, and it really instilled a deep passion for this work in combating these systems and disrupting and creating new systems. And that's ultimately why I became an educator. The picture in the middle is a picture of me with a bunch of my students. I worked in high schools, so first as an English teacher, then as an administrator. I also, on the side, ran an outdoor education program in the school where we would go out camping and hiking. And this is a group of us rock climbing. And then I worn a lot of hats in education, but this is just a picture of me and a couple of students at their graduation pretty recently when I was the vice principal of a high school in the Bay Area. So along the way, as an English teacher, I've been very focused on equity work, on inclusion and representation. And so when I had my first child about 8 years ago, I started to look for books for him. And it was really, really hard for me to find books. So this is my family. And a few years after when he was born, I was looking for books, and I became much more aware of the lack of diversity in children's literature. This is a graph or a pictograph you can see of in 2018. This covers children's books. So that's everything from board books all the way up to young adult novels. And you can see here, and I'm just curious, before we move on, what are some things that you notice about these numbers? If you're able to chat, it would be amazing to see just what's something you notice. I'll give you all a minute or so to sort of think about it and respond. Hopefully people are typing. Maybe you're cooking dinner and you're not able to type. That's okay too. So the numbers are way skewed towards white children. Animals are so much higher. Yeah, if you add up the percentage of people of the global majority or people of color, there are less books about all children of color combined than there are about animals. And half the books at the time are written about white kids. And this doesn't even go into conversations about who's writing the books about kids of color. Oftentimes they're not written by people who share the identity of the character or the story. Often a lot of them are written by white people. So there's a lot of layers within this conversation of inclusion and representation. But this is sort of already after We Need Diverse Books became a really strong movement and has really impacted children's publishing. It was sort of at the beginning of this. My son was born in 2014. And at the time, I sort of had this just really inspired moment of like, stop complaining and you should start writing. So I did. I started to write. I took writing workshops. I went to classes. I went to conferences, and I started to write and submit. And eventually I was able to sign with an agent who submitted my work to publishers. And that is when the rejections started. So at the time, Isaac Kiss in the Corners was called Almond Shaped Eyes. And my agent went on submission with 4 stories. And I just started getting rejections and rejections. You can see this one says, I don't think movie princesses she thinks they set unrealistic expectations for everyone. And therefore she's passing because it's a problem for everyone. So we don't need this book. This is just sort of me responding, sharing with a bunch of writer friends who were all sort of in the same space as me, trying to find agents and trying to publish. I was just, sharing my discouragement, and they keep going. So it was really interesting going through. I was like, oh my, I really got so many rejections. This is another double rejection for 2 different books. The top one says, we don't do Christmas books. This one about Isaac Kiss in the Corners, or what became Isaac Kiss in the Corners, says, I would really love to do a book for Asian people about body positivity, but this feels really negative. I wish it was more upbeat. And then I revised based on some of the feedback I got from other rejections, and the same editor said, I'm so glad she revised, but I still don't like it is basically what it says. And then for almost 2 years, Eyes That Kiss in the Corners and several other books, including my Ai Weiwei picture book, which is coming out this fall, were on submission and just being rejected for so many different reasons. Until one day in 2018, in the summer, I got this email from one of my editors. And essentially what it says here is that she wishes she had a book like this when she was growing up. She says a lot of really nice things about the writing and the story. And this email truly changed my life. Since receiving that email, I've been so just grateful and privileged to be able to publish lots of stories, many of which were the ones that were being rejected over the last 2 years, the first 2 years. So Eyes That Kiss in the Corners was published in January of 2021, 2 years ago. Playing at the Border, A Story of Yo-Yo Ma, is a story that talks about Yo-Yo Ma playing at the border of Mexico and Texas at a time when the government was separating children at the border, and he was sending a very clear message about building bridges and not walls. Eyes That Speak to the Stars came out last year, January. The Silence That Binds Us, which we'll talk more about in depth in a little bit, came out last year, June. One Day was published. This is actually one of the first books I ever wrote, and it was for my son when he was a newborn. That came out just this last March. These two that you see here, On the Tip of a Wave and Say My Name, are books that are both coming out this fall. And then you can see some more coming soon. These are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 other books here, and then a few more that I can't talk about yet because they're not announced. So it's been quite a journey over lots of time, and I'm really excited to be able to talk to you a little bit about The Silence That Binds Us. So I can't do it because since we're not in person, I won't have you come up on stage, so I don't need a volunteer, but would love to see your thoughts in the chat. Is if you know anything about, so if you can see this object lesson right here, if you know anything about making a friendship bracelet, if you could type in the chat what you do, how does it work? And maybe, I'm not sure this will work in person, but so let me just go. When you are making this thing, you kind of start over here, and then you tie this knots, and then you use one color on this side and you tie it all the way across. And I want to just maybe in the chat drop, what do you notice about this particular humongous bracelet so far? Just direct observations. We have like 10 more seconds. It's okay if you can't, you're not in a space where you can chat. We'll come back to this in a little bit. What I'll tell you is, hopefully you notice that there are a lot of strings of different colors, a lot of yarn, but however this is being done is only the white yarn is on the surface. Okay, and usually when we color, it's usually whatever color is next becomes the next line. And so we're gonna come back to that in a little bit. Yes, thank you, Nicole, for jumping in and sharing that. We're going to try playing a game. Can I just see in the chat, are you able to hop on a new tab or on your phone to play an online game? Because if most people aren't, then we'll sort of just move on past this part, which is also totally fine. If you could do a 1 for I'm able to, and then a 2 for I can't, that would be really helpful. Okay, I see. Beautiful. Okay, so we'll go. So if you can go to join.nearpod.com, and then you'll see a place where you can enter a code, and then you enter this code right here, DSAKU. I'm going to pop it in the chat as well. And then the code is DSAKU, because I'm going to close out my screen so I can see the other screen. Okay, so this is what it should look like on your screen, something like this, once you're able to log in and connect and get settled in. I see Nico is here, or Sam. Oh, Sam and Nico are both here. And we'll wait maybe like the code is in the chat. So the link is join.nearpod.com. And then the code that you enter is DSAKU. I dropped it in the chat if you just scroll up. I can go back here so you can see this again. Ah, thank you. Thanks, Nicole. I see some nuts. Hi, Charlotte. We'll wait like one more minute as people log in. If you are logged in or you're logging in, it's okay if we start and you're still going, that's okay. And if you can't log in, you'll see it on the screen. And so hopefully that helps. I'm gonna go like this. Let's see. We're not gonna do that. Okay, I see 4 people in here, 5 people. Huzzah! Hi, everyone. Okay, we're gonna start the game, but keep logging in. You can jump in the middle of the game. Those of you who are looking at my screen are seeing kind of the back end. Oh, Angela is in the lead. Oh, Ethan's taking the lead. Ethan's in the lead. Charlotte's on the board. Hey, Angela, it's a winner. Oh, Angela. Okay, I'm going to close this. Hopefully on your screens, if you have it open, you should see. Oh, Angela, hooray. Okay, so my question for you, and going back to these slides, hopefully you can see them, is what stood out to you when you played this game? Great job, Angela. When you were playing the game or when you were watching the game being played or just reading the questions, what stood out to you? Ethan says, my lack of historical knowledge. Sam says, I felt very stumped. Anyone else want to jump in? Yeah, still have a lot to learn. Yeah, so that kind of brings us back here to this. This idea that if you know how to make a friendship bracelet, and the way I explained it before is you start on one side and you use this string and then you make the color, which is why, so the color should have looked a little bit like this. Pink, and then they just sort of go in order. In order for us to only see white, there's some trickery that has to happen. We have an extra long white yarn. And then in the back, instead of going in order, the white yarn has to actually cross back across to be able to start back at the beginning to then make it white. Okay. And so my question is, what might that have to do with history and our lack of knowledge of history, our particular parts of history? What might this analogy have to do with the game that we played? Ethan says, we know much more about white history than history of minorities or folks of color or marginalized people. Yeah, that's for sure true. And that's what it's taught. Yep. And that's why that's what we know for sure. Lots of history is hidden from us. Yeah, for sure. That too. And those of you who are listening and unable to type, I appreciate just whatever you're thinking. And so I would say, yeah, like a lot of the history that we learn is very whitewashed. And there is so much color in the history of not just Asian folks, Black folks, Indigenous folks, like history that we never learn, such that maybe we learn one or two events, but it's like an addendum into white history without understanding that actually we have been part of this country and all of us have foundational to building up this nation. And we just don't know. We literally know nothing. We've been erased so completely that questions like these, we don't know the answer. And what does that have to do with the silence that binds us? So I'm gonna, before we jump into that book and make all the connections, these are pictures again of me in high school. I went to high school in the Bay Area. And after I graduated from high school at Pali, there were two suicide epidemics several years after I graduated. So the suicide rate in Palo Alto was 4 times the national average. So there was one epidemic in a 9-month period, 6 students died by suicide. And just 4 years later, in a 6-month period, 4 students died by suicide. So these are called like suicide clusters. And nationally, there are maybe 5 a year. And so to have 2 in the same place within such a short period of time was like a real, startling and I wouldn't say wake up call, but a huge red flag about what is happening in this community specifically. However, if we want to look at how the dialogue happened, so there were a lot of mental health experts, a lot of research, a lot of national attention sent here, and people did a lot of research in circles and interviews, but then what they reported is that behind the scenes of what was happening, things like this were being shared, you know, sort of like, well, actually, we really know what's happening. And it was something like this. So here it says, Andrew was broaching a very touchy subject, one that had come up more rudely in comments in Palo Alto online. Heavy stress among good kids was the product of a nasty competitive atmosphere contrived by unethical tiger moms. One commenter wrote, at the end of some of my conversations, a student, teacher, counselor will look around to make sure no one was listening and then whisper a story about an Asian kid being punished or kicked out of the house for a night after getting a B or failing to get into Stanford. Gunn High School, which is the other high school in the community, has more than 40% Asian and some non-Asian parents, particularly ones who'd grown up in town when the Asian population was smaller, felt that the shift was poisoning the entire culture of the school. So there was a really clear narrative about what was happening in this community that was very anti-Asian. So you add that to the experience that I had just maybe a few months prior to when sort of the idea, all of this coming together in an idea for a book, is I was at a dinner party and I was the only Asian person at the party. And it was sort of with a bunch of pretty wealthy folks in Palo Alto, much more established than I certainly was or am, or maybe probably will ever be. And they were talking, and then the idea of the pressure and the stress and then the suicides in Palo Alto came up. And there was a white man who stood up and he basically said, it's because of all the Asians in the community. Their culture makes it too hard for us to compete. That's why so many people are moving. And I was sitting there just so enraged and so shocked. And it just really, like, my own invisibility in every space, in a space where I was breaking bread with somebody and he could say a comment like that, it to my face. I mean, he clearly wasn't saying it to me, but to the table at large, without recognizing that I was sitting there because I was so invisible to him, really hit home. So when I set out to write a novel, I knew I wanted to write a novel about anti-Asian racism in the ways that I personally have experienced or seen it. All of these sort of factors of my own upbringing or having lived here since middle school, of these things that are very much still very real today, sort of came together, and it became just really a question in the story of who is controlling the narrative of what happens. So in the story, the main character, Maybelline, her older brother, who she's really close with, who you see down here, dies by suicide. And he has just gotten into Princeton. And in the aftermath of his death, her family and she are reeling in their grief and trying to heal as they can. And then she goes back to school, and a really wealthy man who is sort of a local, celebrity venture capitalist says essentially what was said to me at the dinner table, that it's the Asians and it's the culture that are causing the problems that are happening in this community. And she talks specifically about her brother. And so she sort of finds herself in a space where her parents are telling her to please be quiet and put her head down and just let things blow over. And she just feels like she has to defend her family. She has to protect her brother's memory. She can't let this other person, and then the community that sort of rises up to back him up, control the narrative about her and her family and her community. This is her best friend, Tia, and then her brother, Danny's best friend, Mark. And so there's about mental health. It talks about solidarity between Black and Asian communities. And ultimately, it's a story of her finding out both the consequences, both challenging and positive, of speaking out and finding truth in her own power. So here is just a very, very small excerpt. She writes poetry, but she also writes other things. She writes in verse, but the novel is prose. So this is when she is realizing she cannot stay silent. She's wrestled and she's wrestled. And here it says, silence is the space between my mom and me, a chasm over which we throw words that make the distance wider. It is the smile with the crooked dimple to the side that hid my brother's pain so well it strangled him while we watched. Silence is a bow so low our foreheads touch the ground in submission under the heels of powerful men and their lies. It is a blanket we pull over our heads to hide from the world, where difficulty breathing is the price we pay for an illusion of safety. My parents want me to be silent, but silence is death. Forgive me, Ma. Forgive me, Ba. I cannot be silent. So the story and my message for everyone is really about finding our own power, recognizing our own power to take back this narrative, this invisibility that is contrived in the same way that this is contrived to be entirely white when it's really built on a backbone of color. It's similar with the way history is told now, with the narratives, the way that narratives about Asian people are used and have changed and continue to be used to uphold the status quo or current dominant systems of power and hierarchies and structures and systems. And I think this is in the story, it's one teenager's journey, but I think for me as an author, and then for hopefully all of us as a larger community, both inter and intra-community solidarity of really working hard to take back the narrative and to tell truth the way that we experience it and not the way that we've been told it happened. So my hope is, that I think actually all of my books really touch on this, even Isaac Kiss in the Corners. It's a lot about power and being a revolution and knowing that we have the power to create change in a world and in systems that often don't want change to happen, and particularly for people who have been so long and too long marginalized and invisible. Okay, so on that note, I'll pause, and if you have questions, I would be so happy to answer them.
All right, everyone, you can use Zoom's Q&A feature, or you can enter them in the chat. If you do use the chat, we might miss them, so I do recommend the Q&A feature. And in the time being, while we wait for some questions, I actually want to have a show and tell, because you did a really good show and tell. I want to be involved. Okay, so I have my own copy right here. Yes, signed first edition. I'm not supposed to brag in these talks, but it's so beautiful. I just really had to. I read this a while ago on my breaks at work, actually in Palo Alto, and I thought the way that you captured what it was like to grow up here was amazing. It was almost eerie to see like the academic environment in the Bay Area captured so well in so many of these small moments, and the way that everyone is trying to get into Stanford and these big tech and everything looming over us. I thought was really amazing. So while we wait for some questions from the audience, I have some, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So one thing that ties all of your books together is beautiful lyrical poetry. What was it like to transition from, into the young adult demographic after writing picture books for so long?
Yeah, I get that question often because maybe it's like such a huge leap, but because I've spent my entire professional career working in high schools, I feel like actually before I had kids, high school kids they have my whole heart. I love that age group of students, and I feel like I relate. I come alive when I'm around them, and I learn so much from just being around teenagers. And whether it's like things like, Miss Ho, you can't use that emoji. That's the old lady emoji. Like you have to use the skull. You can't use the smiley face with the tears. That's like the middle-aged people emoji. That stuff like that. Or just like, I think that recognizing their resilience and the things that they go through and the way they do it with such, I don't say joy, but often they just do it with so much hope for what's possible in the future. And they're so critical and they're so observant. They don't miss anything, whether it's that teacher wore the same pair of pants 3 times this week, or it's like, this is what happened in the world or in my community. They're so aware. So for me, I think transitioning from picture books to YA, I love the freedom of being able to explore all the ideas and really go in depth. In picture books, I do feel like you can explore any idea. You have to do it in a way that's accessible to a 5-year-old, which is possible. But in a young adult novel, I think you're more able to like explicitly explore nuance and things. So I think that it felt natural actually to me. I started writing a middle grade. I've just finished a draft. I've never written a middle grade before. And that actually was really hard because the middle grade voice is not one that I think comes naturally for me.
Well, that was actually one of my questions was like, is there going to be another young adult or middle grade novel? So I'm really excited to hear that. And I actually know a book sale in Palo Alto. I'll be telling about that. I know he'll be really excited. So we've got our first question in the Q&A, and it's, "Hi, Joanna. I was wondering if The Silence That Binds Us touches on the idea of Asian people being a model minority, or
Yeah.
if that's an idea that you'd like to explore. I'm from New York and attending for an author talk grade, but I'm so interested in the book and will be picking it up."
Thank you. And thank you for attending, and to your teacher for assigning something like this for a grade. Yeah, it does explore the model minority myth. I think it goes beyond that and exploring more specifically how the narrative about Asians in America has shifted. So we started off as like that we were brought over as laborers, and anyways, you can go really deep into a lot of it, and then we weren't wanted and we were criminals and drug addicts. And so actually the history of that is that the police used to raid Chinatown all the time because they just had this very clear stereotype of Asians as prostitutes and criminals and drug dealers. And so there was actually a PR campaign waged by leaders in Chinatown to shift the public image, where they intentionally created an image of Asian youth as being very studious and very family-centered and very obedient, to combat what was the more dominant narrative at the time. And so then that narrative, though, you can see how every narrative becomes co-opted by what is really a white supremacist like framework. And that has now was then used as a model minority myth during the civil rights movement to divide, people who have been historically marginalized and oppressed. And then now it's continued to be used in communities like Palo Alto, but around the world even, to say like, we're also a threat because we're too good at school. We don't want them. We don't want to be around them. They're threatening no matter what they are. And we will use whatever narrative to then divide. And so that's one thing I think about the narrative about Asian people, is that it has shifted so many times, and no matter how the community has tried to reclaim our own narratives, it is then co-opted to be used sort of against us and also to divide us. So the answer is yes, it's in the book.
No, that's a great answer. And actually, I love, there are some passages in the book where, I won't spoil anything, but where it's just May reading essentially like the comment section of the fictional Palo Alto Online.
Yeah.
And as someone who has read the Palo Alto Online comment section, it was a perfect recreation, and all those comments totally were realistic. I have I think I saved, I lost my bookmark. I saved a bookmark to show people what they look like. I've never seen a book that does that before, and it was amazing. So I have I do have a question about that. Do you remember seeing those kind of in the local newspaper and in the comments?
I remember that. I also remember there was a time when a Chinese, like a Mandarin immersion school, wanted to open. And so it did end up winning, and it kind of got attached to an existing charter school that's super progressive. But in the like battle to allow this school to open in the community, I mean, it was ugly. If you look at the comments, it's really ugly. And so that was really, I think that actually was sort of my like, holy cow, this is not a safe place for me. But yeah, the comment sections are, they tell you not to read them for a reason.
Yeah, and people have this perception of, it doesn't happen here, which I think is one thing
really
that,
liberal. We're so liberal here. And I think what really is, I think people want to believe they're very liberal, but it's very on the surface, and it's not that far below the surface that all the like very ugly beliefs exist, and it's just covered by a veneer. I think if you, like, I've done anti-racist work, and I've also been in a lot of anti-racist training, and people will say like, sometimes it's harder to come to a place like Palo Alto that's very privileged, that has a lot of people who believe that they're liberal or that they are progressive in their social thinking, because it's all under there, like the anti-Asian, the anti-Black, like the narratives. We don't want people of color in our schools. We don't want those, people don't want those Black and brown kids coming over from the other side of the highway. It's all there, and it's couched in different language, but it means all the same ugly things.
Yeah, and I think it goes into, it's really an untold story. Like I was actually a volunteer around 2012 for teens who were impacted by suicide at the local high schools, and there
Wow.
wasn't an intersexual angle at the time. And I think if it were happening now, there would be. And so even though like I worked in this community with people who were impacted by this, when I read this book, I learned about like a whole new side of it. That part of me was like kind of knocking myself for not really realizing, a big part of it. And I kind of wanted to connect that to a question about kind of something that comes up in the book is a sense of invisibility that a lot of, I think, Asian Americans feel in our society and even within the racial justice movement. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I know her parents kind of handle that, and May deals with that and learns a lot about her own issues and her parents'
Yeah.
issues.
Sure. I think that just like broadly, the invisibility, I mean, it goes back to the game of the history we don't know. And I think sometimes people play the game, they're just like horrified at the things they don't know. But the reality is the teachers were never taught it. And so they don't know how to teach it to us. And the focus and the standards and everything are so white and European centric. And so you don't know what you don't know. And for me, I didn't know anything. I mean, I think as I've gotten older and as I started writing and as I started researching, I've come to really start to understand on just like a beginning level how invisible, like I didn't, for example, I didn't know until pretty recently that Asians have been in the US or in the Americas since the 1500s, that we were brought over as slaves and then as indentured servants who were tricked here. Didn't know that. I didn't know like the Secret War. I didn't know. I mean, there's just like I could write multiple books about all the things I didn't know, and it's just horrifying and appalling to me that you didn't know that that my people have been a huge part of building this country, that the wealth and the prosperity and like the culture, so much is built on the labor and the backs and the culture, frankly, of Asian people. Just since we're talking about, you could say that about many other people too, and then I think on top of that, I never saw myself in books as a child. I never saw myself in movies, except in very stereotypical ways. Like I remember that book. I can't remember what it's called, but it's about the kid whose name was so long and he fell in a well.
Oh.
Tiki Tiki Tembo. And he couldn't get out. No one could save him because they couldn't say his name, so it was so long. Things like that. And I think when we talk about invisibility, it's really for me, it's about this internalized sense that like you don't belong, but it's so deep that you don't even question it. Like I did not question that I never saw myself in books. I never questioned. I just didn't even know it was possible. And so now that I know, one, not only that it's possible, but it is necessary, and I know how much, and I can see how much history has been truly erased. I think books like The History of Asians in America by Erica Lee were life-changing for me. I just was like, oh. So I would recommend listen to it on audio if you're not it's really dense, but it's so powerful. If you need like a more beginning way to step up into the history, like the PBS series of Asians in America is also really powerful, just like a place to start. But so that's on the invisible, like literally we don't learn anything about ourselves in school. So that's one. I think when we talk specifically about like where we belong in like an anti-racist space, for so long, the dialogue about race has been is on a black-white binary. So for I think almost all other folks of color, we're trying to figure out where we fit on this binary. And for some people, they want to be white adjacent. And for some people who are more aware of systems, we choose to be more Black adjacent. But what I think is starting to shift in the dialogue is recognizing we're not either side. Like the racial dialogue is way more complex and nuanced, and way more spaces are needed beyond a Black-white binary. And so I think what's happening now is people are carving out space to have a much more complex and nuanced conversation about all of the multiple intersectionalities, but it is hard because as an Asian person, you walk into a space and people assume you're white, you align white adjacent. And for me, I feel like I have to prove myself in those spaces before I earn trust. And so I think that's just sort of part of the larger picture and the structure and the history of how different groups have been used.
Wow, I would say it really comes in. There are a lot of histories that May's parents tell her that they kind of keep bottled up that she learns from. And on that note, I do have a related question, but everyone remember, we still have some time for the Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left, so there's time for a few more questions. You can use the chat as well if you would like. So one question is that, okay, in this book, May challenges others to engage with their own bias and racism, but you wrote her as a character who has a lot to learn about these things herself, which I really love that. There's some great scenes of her putting her foot in her mouth around other people and realizing afterwards, whoops, I need to try harder. Why did you choose this type of character development for her to kind of be learning about this as she's going?
I think that it's just, it's a specific, well, I think it's for all of us. Learning is a journey when we are raised in a system that doesn't teach us these things. And so, and I think for so many people, the wake up, comes when something affects us personally. And so oftentimes for, I think, especially maybe East Asians, like lighter skinned Asians, I have lots of memories of experiencing racism as a child. I just didn't have the language to process and to talk about it and to explore that. And so I think that it's really like a natural part of the progression is you sort of get fired up about something and you realize this is a problem. Racism is a problem and now it's affecting me. And I think it's really naive. For me, the part that is really pulled from my own experience is thinking like, well, if people just knew, they would change. That's so clearly wrong. And obviously, the more I've done the work and the more I learn, the more I realize, no, this is very intentional. They know, and they want to keep it that way. But I think it starts off as like, this is so messed up. And you kind of want to believe in the best of humanity. And along the way, even for people who've been doing the work for a long time, there's so much to learn and things are always shifting. And so I did want to capture this idea of just growth and that it's learning and nobody is ever at a place where you know everything. And so you hurt people and you have to come back and you have to apologize and you have to learn. But also there's an aspect of grace that happens of like holding people that you love both accountable, but also doing in a way that allows for growth and for mistakes. So I think that's like an important part of the journey to capture for anyone.
And I think it really comes across in the book because those moments where that happen are just moments of just trust and just friends trying not to hurt each other. And it's very powerful. Okay, before we get to our next question, the Q&A, I found it. I found some of my favorite sections of the book. You won't be able to read it, don't worry, but just so you can see. You see, so these are all kind of like the comment section from online. I just wanted to show everyone, give you a visual. I was kind of like hooting and hollering when I was reading that, even though it was like also really difficult,
You're like, no, you're so...
I know. I was like, oh my God, this is what it's like.
Yeah.
All right. So you have another question.
Hi, Ethan.
Yeah, so Ethan says May's parents wanted to keep her head down and remain invisible. What went into writing and researching May's desire to change the narrative and break free from her parents' ideas to fix the situation? Is it more from your personal awakening, or did that kind of take a longer time to capture and develop?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I mean, that's very much my experience, is my parents because of what they went through. I mean, they went through such like very overt racism, which I guess is back. I mean, not that it ever went away, but it's very public again. But their experiences and stories, I think, are coming from a space where they just want to be safe and they want to stay alive and they don't want to get hurt. And that very much, I think, especially in Asian culture, trickles down to the way that they teach us, is this idea of if you just put your head down and you work really hard, people will recognize your hard work and like that stuff will pass. Or if it's dangerous, if you speak out, people will come after you and it's not going to be safe for you. And they aren't wrong. I think it's more just recognizing that mentality of silence continues to reinforce the narrative and to allow and to prevent change from happening. So it's necessary for us to speak out. So I think I didn't, that's actually a great question. I just think that what I was really conscious of was not wanting to reinforce stereotypes about Asian parents and specifically Asian moms, but I also wanted to capture some truth. And the thing that I think I wanted to capture was that everything is really founded in from a space of love, that, whatever, all the things, even the misunderstandings and the chasms and the splits begin for parents and from a space of love and wanting to protect their children. But there's sometimes just a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding in the middle, and the communication skills are not always, it's a language barrier, it's a culture barrier, it's like so many things. But I didn't want to portray them in a way that was like vilifying Asian parents. I'm hopeful that I did it in a way where you can understand where they're coming from. And you can see why May has a hard choice, because both sides really do make sense on some level.
Oh, totally. This is not one of those books, where you're yelling at the screen to the character about what to do. It's a hard decision. And the way I hope, if anyone hasn't read it yet, that you do, because her parents become fleshed out by telling their own stories that May doesn't know about and that she learns, and that really makes what they want her to do seem much more impactful and harder to turn down.
Yeah.
So we have one more question. Oh, never mind. Okay. So all right. Question is, did you use sensitivity readers when you were writing this? And can you tell us a little bit more about what they are and maybe what you learned from them?
Yeah, a lot, because so on multiple levels. So on starting first of all, from the mental health perspective, I know that writing about suicide, especially as someone who I have experienced that in my own family, but not with a relative that was so immediately close to me. I know that I wanted to capture it in a way that felt true to survivors, without sensationalizing, without being something that was both like really overly triggering or something that glorified it in a way. So something like 13 Reasons Why is like what I didn't want to do. And so I really knew, like, if I'm going to write this, it has to be like, I have to get it right. Not that there's one way to get it right, but I definitely can't do it wrong. So there were a lot of mental health reads. I had actually a girl whose brother died by suicide, and they both went to Pali. She was really open with sharing with me a lot of her story. She read it at multiple stages. Then we also had I paid for a mental health person to read it and give me feedback. And then as it was in the editing process, there was another mental health expert who sort of came through and gave feedback. And then there was also feedback just from Black readers, and then specifically feedback from Haitian readers, because her best friend is Haitian. So it was really helpful, actually, like a little bit horrifying actually, to realize, like, in some ways I was trying to do this thing, and I'm someone who did a lot of anti-racist work, and in my first drafts there were things that I did that were reinforcing stereotypes in a way that I didn't even see, that I probably would have seen and called out on my own, but I did it also. So it's just, all of it is a growing experience.
That must have been kind of hard, but very important to go through.
Yeah.
Something that I noticed when reading it, it definitely, even though, it is about someone kind of recovering from suicide in their family, it doesn't really, it's such an uplifting book, and it's so lighthearted in so many ways. And I was appreciating, like, kind of the craft that went into that. And there are some details, like, there's a big time jump in the beginning. After, May hears about it, you skip to when she goes back to school, and it's like, I think several months, right? And so you don't necessarily see someone in this really probably very difficult place. You see them as they're being reintroduced. So that was really interesting. And I want to, as we wrap up, I want to ask one or two questions.
Okay.
I think a lot of readers of your books feel very seen by the perspectives that you write. And on that note, just so people can see them, I do have some real library copies here. I don't have all of them. But Isaac Kiss and Corners is so good. You should check it out at your library. There's usually a copy available. So is Isaac Speak to the Stars. And one is the newest one, right?
Yep.
Actually, I'm going to read this one after the talk.
Yay.
But I just wanted to let everyone get to see them. and maybe check them out.
And then
All
this
right.
one, I just happen to have one.
Oh, good. Oh my
Here's
God.
sitting at the
Awesome.
border, just so you can see it.
That one I should read because
Online.
I actually don't know that much about Yo-Yo Mom. Kind of embarrassed to say, but
Like such an amazing human.
so
Seriously.
that kind of brings me to this question of, do you have books that kind of made you feel seen? You mentioned History of Asians in America. Are there any others, or is this kind of still a growing list for you?
Oh, I mean, there's so many more now. And I think that's something that's like really beautiful about being part of the Kidlit author community, and particularly whether it's Asian authors or other authors of color, is so many. I think it's like a really tight-knit community and a really supportive one. So reading so many other people's stories is just like so what's that one? It's like, let's talk about everything and nothing. There's just so many more. There aren't enough, and we need way more. But I think there are so many more books coming out by Asian authors and other authors who speak to so many of these experiences that or it's just like seeing an Asian character in a fantasy book, like Stacey Lee and Misa Sugiura both have books that just recently came out, and they're both middle grade fantasy, and it's just so fun to be able to see parts of our culture and like our ways of being, but in just like a super fun epic adventure.
Yeah, not always like one of those kind of more grittier epics, you know.
Right,
But
right.
your books are also all very celebratory, too. So I think I have one more question. Oh yeah, do you know what it would have been like if you'd had a book like The Silence That Binds Us growing up?
I think sometimes I'm thinking like Guys That Kiss in the Corners. That's a book I wish I had when I was a kid. I was the kid who was like looking in the mirror like this and wishing I had bigger eyes. So my hope is just that the people who read these books can recognize their own power, but just feel like their own value and worth, and know that their own stories, however they choose to tell them, matters, and that raising their voice and taking up space and standing up, those are all things that we can do and we can do together. And when we do it together, we will all rise together. So that's really the hope. Even, and enjoy. Like I don't only write books that are very heavy, but a lot of them do tend to talk about social justice things. But I have like a Christmas book out next year, and it's just about this time that I brought my kids to San Francisco, and my daughter, who was 3, it happened to be Santa Con, which I didn't know when I took her there. And she saw all the Santas everywhere and just like threw her arms in the air and went screaming down the street, Santa, this is my birthday. So like we have experiences like that too. And like these moments of joy and just being human also need to be captured in stories. And so hopefully I can continue to write and capture so many other parts of just, one particular experience and perspective.
Well, I definitely hope so, and I'm going to be keeping an eye out for that middle grade one.
Thanks. That's really bad right now, but give it a couple of years.
All right, well, we do have to wrap up. Thank you, Joanna, so much for this insightful conversation, for that great presentation, and for reminding me how much history I have to learn because of that penguin game. And thank you to everybody who joined us, whether you're from all the way from Brooklyn or from here on the West Coast. Please check out our upcoming author talks at smcl.org/author talks. We'd also appreciate if you could let us know how we did with this program at smcl.org/rate this event. Hope everyone has a really good evening, and thank you again so much, Joanna.
Yes, thank you all for being here.
All right, bye everyone.
Hey,
Thank you.
everyone.